and we are going to be discussing the invasion of the Christians into Ireland. We'll be learning about how Christianity came to Ireland, how it spread and was accepted, and how it changed the Irish and how the Irish changed it. We will also look at Irish contributions to Christianity as a whole and to the rest of Europe. I had mentioned last week that we'd be talking a little bit about the influence of Romans, and so I'm going to talk about that here. When the Romans failed to conquer Ireland, Christianity definitely succeeded. How Christianity first came to Ireland and spread, little is known specifically, but no doubt there were interactions between traders, raiders, and slaves that helped that spread of Christianity, or at least a knowledge of the faith, come to Ireland. There were definitely Christians in Ireland by the 430s in substantial numbers, because we know in that year Ireland was sent their first bishop, Palladius, by the Pope, and the Pope would not have sent a bishop to Ireland if there were not a substantial number of people practicing Christianity in Ireland. We don't know much about Palladius. He's actually only mentioned in a couple of sources that survive to this day, and it's only mentioned that he was sent to Ireland. There's no discussion of how it went, and Palladius isn't mentioned by St. Patrick in any of his writings either. But we know that Palladius went to Ireland with a couple other missionaries to set up churches near the county of Kildare and the county of Carlow. The fact that we don't know much about Palladius is unfortunate, but we do know a lot about the famous missionary who was sent to Ireland after him. This was a Roman Briton named Patricius, and he was sent to Ireland in 432, possibly. We're not sure. A lot of these dates are a little iffy, give or take 10 years or so. And St. Patrick was very successful in his Christianizing mission in Ireland. In his confession, written in the 470s, Patrick tells us his family were Christians living in Britain, probably near Wales or on the western side of England. His father was a minor Roman official and a deacon with a small estate in western England or in Wales, like I said. Patrick said he was raised in comfort with servants and was educated. At the age of 16, he tells us he was kidnapped by a group of Irish pirates and forced to work as a slave in Ireland. He also mentioned he was kidnapped with hundreds of other Englishmen or Romans at the time. So we know the practice of slavery at this point in Ireland was pretty widespread. Patrick tells us he was forced to work as a slave in Ireland. He said he was sold to a family for whom he was a slave for 6 years, and he watched over their sheep herds. It was during this time of extreme loneliness, hunger, and exposure that his Christian faith grew beyond anything he had had before he was kidnapped. He tells us that it was during one of these times where he was out on the hillside with the herds of sheep that he was sleeping, and in his sleep he heard a voice telling him his servitude was over and a ship was awaiting him. Patrick wakes up and he decides to do what the voice tells him. He manages to escape and travels about 200 miles to the shore, where he encounters a ship of traders. They agree to give him passage to Britain, and after a few adventures and holy trials in Gaul, Patrick eventually is able to return to his family's estate in Britain after the absence of nearly 8 years. Patrick tells us that his parents were overjoyed to see him and pleaded with him to stay at home with them, which initially seemed to be his plan. He restarted his interrupted education. Apparently, he was quite embarrassed by the state of his Latin learning, as he was sitting amongst much younger school children and learning to speak Latin. Before long, Patrick receives another vision in his sleep, though. And he tells us, and that's this quote that I have on the slide here, he tells us, "A man whose name was Victorius, or Victoricus, coming as it were from Ireland, with so many letters, they could not be counted. He gave me one of these, and I read the beginning of the letter. the voice of the Irish people. While I was reading out the beginning of the letter, I thought I heard at that moment the voice of those who were beside the wood at Vaucoultes, near the Western Sea. They called out as if it were in one voice, "We beg you, holy boy, to come and walk again amongst us." This vision that Patrick recounts seemingly was telling him to return to Ireland and to preach the gospel. So Patrick decided to leave his family's estate and travel to the continent. There he studied theology and eventually became ordained as a priest while he was in Gaul. After being ordained, Patrick took it upon himself to missionize in Ireland. He asked to be appointed as the Bishop of Ireland instead of Palladius, and he returns to Ireland to preach the gospel and convert his former captives to Christianity. So there is some debate about where in Ireland St. Patrick was held as a captive. According to his own words in this earlier quote that I just read, he was near the Vaucoultes Wood, near the Western Sea. And this has led earlier scholars to believe that Patrick was held in northern Connaught. You can see on the slide here, I've marked this area that's been identified as the Vaucoultes Wood in Western Connaught. But later scholars, more recent scholars in the 1930s, argue that the wood of Vaucoultes is actually near Glenriff in Northern Ireland. So I have it marked here on this map as well. I've got a larger map and then a more detailed map. And they believe that this was the site of his enslavement. And it's mostly due to the fact that Patrick visits this area when he returns to Ireland on his missionizing trip. St. Patrick is strongly associated with this area more than any other area in Ireland, whereas there's not evidence that Patrick visited County Mayo or Connaught while he was missionizing in Ireland. So that's why scholars believe that maybe where he was located was actually in Northern Ireland as opposed to. According to the Annals of Ireland, detailing St. Patrick's arrival in Ireland, the coming of St. Patrick was expected. In fact, the Annals record that he came in particular at the invitation of a petty king known as de Cook. The ship that was carrying St. Patrick and his party first landed in Wicklow. So if you look at the map, I've got kind of this square down here. So they first landed there, but then they journey up the coast past Dublin, and they touch at the Skerries Islands, and then they continue up past the Boyne to an area called Stratford Lough, entering a narrow fjord where the party then journeyed right up to the area that King de Cook was in charge of. And they believe that the probability of the truthfulness of this tale is pretty high because the burial site, or the believed burial site of St. Patrick, is actually located in the same area, which is now known as Downpatrick. So I believe this X right here is the initial landing space for St. Patrick and his missionaries. So I was just discussing where they believe St. Patrick landed the first time. There is an entry in some Irish annals that discuss his journey, which is why we can kind of reconstruct that and why we think that he landed in this area of Downpatrick. Okay. So first off, I want to kind of face off with some of the many popular legends and miracles that there are out there about Patrick. So first off, we have the legend of him driving all the snakes out of Ireland. There's a story of him battling the High King of Ireland's Druids during the Feast of Beltane. Remember, that's the Feast of the Fires where the Druids use fire to purify the cattle herds. It's rumored that he started his own fire that the Druids were unable to put out, and thus he was able to prove the superiority of his Christian god's powers. There's also a legend about him using the shamrock to explain the Holy Trinity to the Irish. And then there's another legend about him explaining Christianity and the connection to the Celtic religion and how it intermixed by drawing a pagan sun circle and putting it over the intersecting part of the cross, and thus creating that Celtic cross. So there's a number of these legends that talk about what Patrick did here. And at least one of these is definitively false. There have never been snakes in Ireland. We can't unprove any of the others, but we know for sure there were never snakes in Ireland that he drove out. It's definitely sort of this reference to him driving the devil or the pagan devils out of Ireland for sure, but it started to get taken as fact over time. Patrick's conversion of the Irish itself might seem miraculous, though, because for the most part it was very peaceful, bloodless, and unlike almost every other Christian conversion efforts. So his conversion of the Irish itself seemed a little bit miraculous. The key to Patrick's successes was that he lived with the Irish. He had learned their ways and their language, and he used his knowledge of their religion and social structure to talk about Christianity in ways that the pagan Irish would respond to. So some of the ways that he spoke with the Irish and eased his conversion process include the fact that he used his knowledge of that social structure to enhance his own standing. So he started to act like he was one of those traveling bards, those Philiads. And he used this aura about himself to impress and treat with powerful men, working to convert them as well as the lower sewers and doers of society. So acting as if he was one of these Philiads kind of gave him that sense of importance that the Irish put towards those Philiads originally. He debated and he battled with Druids, supposedly using magic to prove his points about God and impress the pagan Irish. He befriended a famous Druid, a Druid Philiad, so he was not only a priest, but he was also one of these poets. And the stories about his friendship with this Druid really stressed that Patrick knew Irish folklore and details about the Celtic religion. And he never sought to eliminate all pagan customs and feasts. Rather, he allowed these celebrations to continue and didn't speak against them. And he would explain where they would fit within the Christian faith. And eventually we see a number of these pagan festivals being adapted and adopted into the Irish Christian tradition. He traveled to important pagan sites and he preached there. He baptized thousands. He ordained many Irish priests. And he set up apparently about 300 churches throughout the island. And now, these stories about what Patrick did while he was in Ireland missionizing, we have them from very few sources. And one of the most important sources we have are from the Church of Armagh, which was writing in around the 9th century. And they were writing in support of St. Patrick's sainthood. And so they do tend to talk about his missionizing efforts in these miraculous terms. So some of this information, we don't know if it's absolutely true, but it's the only source of information we have. So this 300 churches that he set up throughout the island might not be the case. We know for sure, according to different annals that talk about St. Patrick at the time, that he was mostly in the northern part of Ireland. But again, we don't know this for sure, so we do have to go by the information we have. The churches that he built were modeled on the local style, so the Irish style. They used wood instead of stone, as was the custom. And the ornamentation and the decoration of the churches and the shrines that he set up were done in an Irish way. And so it looked Irish, and it was created by Irish men as well. When he established the clergy to preach at these churches, he selected those clergy members from within the Irish society instead of importing foreign priests. He accepted young boys into his employ, much like that Celtic custom of fostering, and he would then train these young Irish boys into the Christian faith and train them to be the future priests of Christianity in Ireland after him. And they would travel with him from Tuath to Tuath. And the more of these young boys that he was fostering, the larger his entourage got, and the more important his status got within the Irish community as well. In his confessions, so that primary source that I provided for everyone to read for this week, in his confessions, Patrick tells of how he would give presents to the kings that he would visit. Again, that shows that he's participating in that Celtic custom of gift giving as a way of showing gratitude, and again, participating in that culture. Patrick knew the importance that was placed on Brehon law in Irish society, and so he strove to blend Christianity and these long established laws together. According to the Church of Armagh that was writing in the 9th century, St. Patrick gathered together 9 men to deal with the impacts of Christianity on Brehon law. 3 of these men were bishops, including St. Patrick himself. 3 of them were kings, including Leary, the High King of Ireland at the time, and the remaining 3 were Brehons, so practitioners and those who were knowledgeable of the Brehon laws. So together, these 9 men, their labors extended over the years of from 438 to 441, so about 3 years or so, and they went through and examined all of the Brehon laws and revised as many of them as needed to be revised. Many of these old Brehon laws they rejected as obsolete or pertaining to pagan rites, so no longer applicable, or they were unsuited to the altered conditions of the Irish people at this present time. The remainder that was left after kind of culling this list down with suitable amendments were finally embodied into a legal text called Saonash Mór, or the Great Book of Irish Law, which neither bishop, king, or Brehon ever afterwards attempted to alter. So once St. Patrick and this group of 8 other men got together and examined these Brehon laws and applied them to the Christian faith, there was never any attempt to change it after that, at least not on a large scale that we know of. So this process took about 3 years. Now, the Seamus Mór does not apparently cover what we would consider criminal law, and it appears that that was not covered because less of that has to do with Christian beliefs and more just punishment for crimes, and that was mostly left in its original form. Harmony between the new Christian culture and existing pagan literature was deliberately cultivated as well. Patrick mimicked those schools of the Irish learning class. Remember the Eas Dana, that learning class that we'd have different artisans, and this is where the Filiads come from. This is where the Brehon law practitioners come from, the harpists. So St. Patrick mimicked those schools that those crafts were learned in and taught, and he turned them into Christian schools for teaching the Christian faith and Latin as well. And so soon these Christian Irish schools were able to rival those Irish pagan schools. And there is evidence that there was some conflict between the schools he set up and these Eras Dana schools, but eventually these schools sort of fused together and eventually were kind of a seamless school all in one. Of course, the Christians did find it necessary to exercise the things that were objectionable in these Eras Dana schools, much like what they did with the Brehon laws. But a great mass of the pagan Irish literature that the Filiads passed on and knew was preserved through this incorporation of the schools. And then also then by the work of monastic scribes, which we will talk about in a little bit. There was definitely a mutual give and take between the Irish culture and the Christian culture that was kind of coming in. But the result of this blending was really this brilliant religious and outstanding cultural activity that resulted. Patrick knew the Irish political system well enough to approach the establishment of his bishoprics and his churches, not based on geographic boundaries, like other dioceses were in the former Roman lands. Instead, he set his up where the powerful where the different kings of the Tuaths were located, where they were centrally located. So some churches were built as permanent structures. Many others were made just like those transportable houses of the more nomadic Irish. Making them transportable, these transportable churches, meant that it was easy to move them along with the people who moved with the cattle herds seasonally. So that those churches were able to follow those people throughout the year based on the seasonal movements of their herds. He built the Irish church up according to existing political conditions and in harmony with the society he wished to incorporate it within. His conversion efforts seem to be based mostly in the northern parts of Ireland, as I earlier explained, and this again leads credence to the idea that these are the areas that he was held as a slave and knew best from his previous time. Powerful kings and nobles might not have originally converted to Christianity, but they did grant tracts of land to Patrick, which he was able to establish some of those permanent churches and some of those schools that he founded on. Converts from people who St. Patrick converted made up his Irish congregation, and it was from those earlier converts that he created his priesthood, and then later those regional bishops and abbots and abbesses came from that. Legend has it, though, that when Patrick died, it was on a March 17th of 461, and his body is supposedly buried in Downpatrick, where he had originally landed when he started his missionizing movements. Now, the date of his death is as sketchy as the details of his life. The March 17th might be true, which is why we celebrate St. Patrick's Day on that. But again, it's a give and take of about 10 years or so based on that, the year of his death. But what we do know for sure is that it was during the 5th century when his conversion efforts were really taking hold and when he started doing that. So we know the 5th century was important. Okay. So I'm going to talk slightly out of order just because it's going to make it a little bit more seamless when we have our break between today and tomorrow. So I'm going to talk about some of the other religious people who are very important at the earlier time of Christianity, even though it's a little out of order when we start talking about monasticism, but it just seems easier that way to talk about it now. So there were many other religious people and saints that were important in the earlier Christian period of Ireland. The pagan past was not far from the minds of these early Irish Christians, and even their saints share similarities to previous pagan gods. And part of the reason Christianity was able to take hold in Ireland so quickly was, again, this blending of the pagan and Christian beliefs that St. Patrick himself helped smooth along. The veneration of saints becomes very important in the Irish Christian faith. And the connection between these saints and the places that they founded or were connected to has even greater appreciation for these religious sites. So the first person who's important that I want to talk about is Saint Enda. He was born probably in the mid 400s and died around 530. Again, this is kind of some iffy dates. Now, Enda was an Irish prince. He was the son of Conall Deg O'Neill of Ulster. He was a skilled warrior, and he actually eventually became the king of Orel himself. Enda gave up his throne and went on pilgrimage to Rome. He became ordained in the priesthood while he was there. And all of this happened through the intervention of his sister, who was known as Saint Francia, and she was an abbess. So she encouraged him to give up his worldly life and go on pilgrimage to Rome to find his Christian faith. He later returns to Ireland, similar to what St. Patrick had done, and he sets up churches around the area of Orel in Ulster, near present-day Drogheda. Later, he traveled all the way across Ireland to Galway Bay, and he founded a monastery on one of the Aran Islands known as Inishmore. And he established this monastery in 484. And supposedly, this is the first monastery established in Ireland. And this is a very important site in the history of Irish monasticism because many of our later important figures that I'm going to talk about came to Inishmore to be trained in the monastic practices. These include Kieran, the founder of Clonmanoise, Saint Finian, the founder of Moleville, Saint Brennan, the navigator, and Saint Columba of Iona. So those are some of our really important figures who were trained at this monastery in Inishmore. The next saint I want to mention is Saint Bridget of Kildare. We are pretty sure about her birth date is 453, and she died in 524. She was supposedly the daughter of a Druid priest who was later baptized by Patrick himself. She went on to found her own monastic community. Her feast day is February 1st, which also coincides with the first day of spring and that pagan festival of Imbolc, which is the lambing festival. Bridget, to avoid kind of a forced marriage, scarred her face so that she was no longer seen as a valuable commodity, and she became a nun after scarring her face. So she goes on to found the convent at Clara in County Offaly, and then another convent in Kildare in 484. So around the same time that our first monastery is being established at Inishmore. And now our dates for the founding of Bridget's convents are a little iffy as well. It may have just adopted this same date for consistency in the earlier years. But this convent at Kildare was so popular, it said that 10,000 nuns came and went through there. But if you remember, we not only have this Saint Bridget of Kildare, but the pagan faith in Ireland also had a goddess named Bridget. And this Bridget was associated with spring and fertility and associated with that festival of Imbolc. So it's possible there was some blending of the pagan goddess in with this sort of holy nun image as well. So there's a little blending there. The next saint that I want to talk about is Saint Columba, probably born around 521 and died probably around 597. Now, Columba was part of the Royal O'Neill family that was located near Donegal. He was said to be a tall man, charismatic. He was raised as a Christian, and he was sent to be educated at that monastery in Inishmore. After being ordained as a priest, he traveled further north to the area of Derry, so in Northern Ireland, where he founded his own monastic house, the Dubh Regas, which is known as the Black Church, and he founded that in 546. Columba got involved in a dispute with his former monastery of Moleville over a copied manuscript, which these copied manuscripts, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later in our lecture. Copied manuscripts were extremely valuable. They were all done by hand, and so it took a lot of time and effort to do those. And there was a dispute over who owned the original copy and who owned the copied text. And this was with this monastery he had been at for a while, this monastery called Moleville. And this dispute over this manuscript got so big that the High King of Ireland actually got involved. And there's a number of other political issues because remember, Columba is part of the O'Neill royal family as well. So this issue over the manuscript results in a battle between the High King of Ireland and the Clan O'Neill. Columba is blamed after the fact for this battle, where 3,000 people supposedly died, and a synod of clerics is called, so a group council is called, and they decide as punishment for Columba's involvement in this battle that he should be exiled from Ireland, which is really sad. So in 563, Columba sails for Scotland, where he founds a monastery on the island of Iona. And now this monastery at Iona becomes a beacon for Celtic Christianity and an important illuminating and manuscript transcribing location. There was this idea that to be a true missionary, one must be in exile for Christ. And so these monastic men who wanted to be exiles for Christ would leave their homes to go live with other Christians in these isolated places, thereby becoming closer to God. And Iona is one of these places. It's on an island off the outskirts of the western area of Scotland. Columba made inroads and converting efforts with the Scottish Picts and the northern parts of England, which, if you remember at this point, the Roman Empire had brought Christianity to England and to Scotland and to Wales. But when the Roman Empire fell, we see kind of a collapse of Roman power and control. And this is where St. Patrick when he was kidnapped, that's what's happening at that time period. But after the Romans pull out of England, we start to see a lot of these Germanic tribes, the Saxons, the Juts, the Engles, which is where England comes from. But these people moved in, and they were all still practicing Celtic paganism. So we actually see the majority of England kind of revert back to paganism. And so what Columba was able to do was sort of to start spreading Irish Christianity into England again. So I'm going to now talk about another one of these famous saints, and his name is Saint Brennan the Navigator. And his birth and death dates are a little iffy, but we're going to, for timing's sake, say he was born in 490 and died in 577. Now, we believe he was ordained in 512. He founded numerous monasteries. St. Brennan is famously renowned for his legendary journey to the Isle of the Blessed. There are many versions of this story that exist that were passed down over the centuries, but all of them tell about how he and a number of other monks set out onto the Atlantic Ocean to search for the Garden of Eden. He is said to have encountered a sea monster. He actually had landed on this sea monster thinking he was an island, when it turns out to be a sea monster named Jaconus. This story of his journey into the sea, trying to find the Garden of Eden, has parallels in a lot of other journey stories, not just in Irish mythology, but in present day mythology. So think Sinbad the Sailor, or even Pinocchio, or Jonah and the Whale. But the story of St. Brennan the Navigator is that he returns to Ireland, and then he goes to Britain to start converting the pagans there. So those are the 4 early Irish saints that I want to talk about. But I'm going to now move on to monasticism itself and talk about that for a little bit before we end class to answer any questions that people might have. Skipped ahead. So according to Patrick's confession, he said, quote, "Sons and daughters of Irish chieftains are seen to become monks and virgins of Christ." Now, this quote implies that while Patrick was living, he was establishing some form of monasteries and nunneries in Ireland. Not fully fledged monasteries, but probably he's more talking about these schools that he established to educate the Irish in Latin and then in the Christian faith. After his death, the schools that he established next to these church sites, those are what we believe kind of grew into our later monasteries. And the population was made up of these scholarly monks who then became the center of Christian practice in Ireland. These monasteries are based on earlier examples that we see Coptic Christian monasteries that flourished in North Africa and in more secluded areas of Italy. Think St. Anthony in the mountainous deserts, kind of those stories of monasteries. These were religious houses where men or women lived under a rule. So they lived under very strict lives focused on prayer, on scholarship, and communal survival. Monks were known as regular clergy, whereas priests and the religious who went out and dealt with the public were called secular clergy. Monasteries became centers of learning where the written word, Latin, helped to bring literacy to Ireland. So these monasteries became a focus not only of Christian faith, but towns started to grow up around the more important and well situated monasteries. The areas that were, and these areas, these towns around monasteries really become our first sort of villages and permanent settlements in Ireland where we have a large population. And many of the monks who would be at the monastery still maintained relationships with their families. And this created a greater sense of community between the local Tuatha and the monastery that existed in that land. These monasteries were self sufficient places that grew their own food, looked after animals for not only the wool, but the byproducts of food that would be produced from them too. And they were able to kind of create everything they needed for their own daily lives within their own monastic community. And as the towns, these communities built up around the monasteries would provide spiritual ministrations to the local families, and they would teach the children as well. And the families that lived in these communities would help with the agricultural labor and then with the livestock owned by the monasteries. Now, at this early point in Christianity, celibacy was not a requirement for those seeking a religious life, and many monks were married and had families. They would live with their families in the community that surrounded the monasteries, but would still be involved in their monastic duties. These married monks participated in the religious life. They attended church services. They would go to confession and they would also receive confessions. They would sing hymns while they lived with their families and worked the lands and doing other useful trades. This dynamic worked really well, the monastery and the village growing together. And this enabled the monks to take on greater tasks, like creating and copying literature and that highly specialized metalware that Ireland becomes known for at this time period. Because the community that grew up around the monastery, because they were able to work the land and do the agriculture and look after the herds, that allowed the monks over time to be able to use their time towards these artistic pursuits rather than in the daily struggle for life, with working with the herds. So it was this community, this relationship that they developed that allowed this artistic outlet for the Irish monks. There were drawbacks to the monasteries having such a close connection to the Tuathas, to the communities in which they lived. And the principal issue became the fact that the local king of that Tuatha, the local Ri, would sometimes, it would be their clan that set aside that those lands that the monastery would be on. And so that local king often felt that he had rights over that Irish religious community. Local kings would impose their own choice of abbot on the monastery, usually one from their own family. But sometimes, to the more extreme point, is that the monasteries would get dragged into the local politics and the local clan warfare that their local Ri was involved in. And at times, monks themselves were actually expected to join in the fighting.